there is an idea of the four aspects of Buddhahood, and often referred to as the five Buddha families. And the fifth one is Amoghasiddhi, whose color associated color is green, and it is really seen as a kind of a convergence of all the other qualities.
So, one female, green, one male, this, so very good.
An auspicious beginning, Your Holiness. We're very happy to be back. Yesterday was quite a day. I think perhaps a mental marathon, a long journey through many complicated ideas. Some sparks were flying at the end, and perhaps they were making space for some new openings in our thinking. Certainly, from my perspective, I felt that. The sessions yesterday ended with Michel and Christophe sharpening their points of difference about the relationships between mind, brain, consciousness, and experience, and the challenges that we saw them put to each other more and more clearly, more and more sharply, were tremendously illuminating, I think, for us all. So I want to express my gratitude, our gratitude, to both of you for venturing into the lion's den on our behalf. We learned from your courageous encounter. Your Holiness then suggested, after they had had their conversation, that we need to clarify our definitions of what we mean by consciousness. And when you said that, I felt some clouds lift, some clarity enter. And then Richie followed with the observation that one very important function of consciousness is to regulate our emotions. That the angry faces, like the ones that we weren't able to see consciously in the slides that Christophe was showing us, that those angry faces can cause us to make negative judgments later on, of which we are entirely unaware, ignorant or prejudicial judgments of which we might be ashamed if we knew we were making them. And Arthur pointed out then that this observation, Richie's observation, brings us back to the ethical questions that are motivating much of our work and our dialogue together. He said all that philosophizing that we've been doing is not just for fun. We did have fun. It has consequences in the world. And that's our topic for today. I want to show you a slide of a picture that one finds in the West. There's a person we look to when we think about ethical problems in the Western world. His name is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and this quotation one finds on posters and billboards and maybe even T-shirts and coffee mugs. And I think this quotation in some ways says everything we need to hear about this question of ethics. The Dalai Lama, when asked what surprised him most about humanity, answered, "I hope you really said this and they didn't make it up." What surprised you most about humanity? Man, because he sacrifices his health in order to make money, then he sacrifices money to recuperate his health, and then he is so anxious about the future that he does not enjoy the present, the result being that he does not live in the present or the future. He lives as if he is never going to die and then dies, never really having lived. I think that's a very complete description of our human dilemma. So today we turn to that puzzle in part. I think every one of us will carry back home from our time together on this historic occasion with you memories and vivid impressions of our intense week here, wrestling with some of the most challenging, most profound and enduring questions with which we humans have grappled through the ages. And in our lifetime, in this lifetime that's been given to us now, the pace of scientific progress is accelerating rapidly with the stunning and in some cases exponential advances in the technologies of investigation, of computation, of communication. Christoph said yesterday, I hadn't heard this, that the internet is now as complex as the human brain. That's a mind-boggling thought for this brain anyway. In spite of the unprecedented pace of change, it was clear, I think, by the end of the day yesterday, that we will have to be patient, however much we may disagree about what is ultimately knowable in some varieties and senses of knowing, which we, I think, also have to define. Christoph wants to measure it all, and he thinks he can. The Frenchmen, Michel and Mathieu, want to reserve a space for not only experience, but perhaps we can say mystery. Arthur, ever the optimist, is intent on building a bridge across that divide. It was all quite fascinating and even fun. And meanwhile, there is no doubt that we see misery all around us, and we see ignorance, and what seems like willful disregard of dangerous forces that we humans have unleashed on the world with these big brains of ours that need big hats with many holes. So this brings us to what I often experience in my personal life as the largest question of all, which is how then shall we live? Today we will hear from 6 presenters who are addressing these pragmatic and more immediate questions in their work. As with the natural scientists and philosophers with us here, our speakers today stand in for a great and growing cadre of scholars and educators and activists who are doing this work. They will help us explore what we have learned, what we are learning, about applications of contemplative practice to relieve human suffering, to promote human flourishing, the 2 prongs of the mission of the Mind and Life Institute that has emerged out of the quarter century of dialogues hosted by Your Holiness. Emerged, I should say, not by accident, but with wise and patient cultivation over those 25 years by, first of all, Your Holiness and many dedicated people inspired by your vision, by your presence. Your presence has had a profound impact on our discussions over these past 4 days, the depth of your engagement, the generosity of your listening, the originality of your questions. We have all been deeply touched by that, and we thank you for it, and we marvel at your stamina and your resilience. Today, with these reports from the field of practice and application in clinical and educational programs, as well as broader scale social interventions, we will see some of the fruits of your energetic and conscious cultivation, like the trees planted decades ago to line the roads of this settlement so that residents today can enjoy the shade and the beauty without even knowing who it was that put them there. Jimpala recalls and told me last night that he, as a young boy, was involved in the very hard work of taking care of those very small saplings and making sure that they could grow into big trees. As we have said repeatedly about the big questions in philosophy and physics and neuroscience, there is a great deal we still need to learn in this messy field of applications we enter today. Today's presenters will offer a flavor of the kinds of work being done and an appreciation, I think, for the passion of the people doing that work, planting seeds to benefit generations yet to come. We'll begin with my friend and colleague, Sona Demijian. She's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of Colorado in Boulder, Colorado. She's involved, has been with the Mind and Life Institute on the Research Advisory Board, very helpful and important in that role. And she does studies of clinical applications of mindfulness-based training. She will provide us with an overview of that field. You know, your friend John Kabat-Zinn has been instrumental in beginning that series of studies, and it is blossoming. And Sana will give us a sense of that. She is an important investigator in that area. Her particular focus has been on depression, and within depression, on depression among women who have during pregnancy or right after having given birth. But she has a much broader overview of this area of endeavor that she will present to us. So with that, Sana.
Actually, Diana, the person who was responsible for those trees is actually here, Greta Jensen, the appropriate technology for
Is
development.
that right? Ah.
Don't worry, yes.
Well, we appreciate them. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
Your Holiness, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about this work. We've had wonderful presentations, as Diana mentioned, from different facets of science, neuroscience, physics. And today I come representing really a tradition, the facet of clinical psychology. And I want to begin with a picture of the University of Colorado at Boulder, which is my home and where I work, which is, as you can see, nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in the United States. Beautiful place, although I know from Mechula's photographs, not as majestic mountains as in Tibet and Nepal, but a wonderful place to live and work. And I show this picture to begin because in the history of clinical psychology, there was an important meeting that took place in this university in 1949. And that meeting codified an approach to training clinical psychologists that said that it was essential to include science, as part of the curriculum. That although psychology had a long history of practice and clinical application, what was necessary was to integrate that with scientific principles and scientific methods. And I know from the wonderful meeting that we all had with the monastic community yesterday and hearing from the abbots and meeting with them last night, that this moment in 1949 in the history of psychology is nowhere near the magnitude of what is happening here and the reason that we're speaking here today. But I think it's an important point of connection, because what that meeting and that model, which has become known as the Boulder model, and it guides the training that's delivered in my department and departments like the one where Richie is, really said is that science and practice can come together in a way that mutually elevates each one, that there's an important dialogue between the two, so that science is not eclipsing or obscuring the importance of application and practice, but really the integration of the two helps to enrich and enliven and improve each individually. So if we look at the history of clinical approaches in the West, and I don't have time to discuss all of these, but there are a number of different clinical approaches to alleviate human suffering that have been developed in the West. What the Boulder model and similar efforts really underscored was the importance of bringing a scientific approach to the study of these applications. Now, among these approaches, the ones that have received the greatest and the most rigorous kind of empirical testing have been the behavioral and the cognitive behavioral therapies. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit today because it's those therapies that have been integrated with a meditation practice is delivered in Western healthcare settings. And in order to do that, as Diana mentioned, there's really one place that we have to start in terms of the history of these efforts in the West, and that's with someone who's well known and a good friend to you, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who basically took in the 70s the practices from the Buddhist tradition, meditation practices, and began to deliver those in a purely secular context with patients in Western healthcare settings. He will talk a little bit more about the types of practices that he used, but he delivered these under an umbrella term which was mindfulness. So the delivery of mindfulness-based stress reduction was the original program that he developed. Now, initially, that program was applied primarily to physical health types of problems like chronic pain. And it was initially greeted with some kind of skepticism in the Western healthcare settings. But what we see over time is a huge increase. I'm going to show you a page from a report from the Institute of Medicine, which can't really get any more sort of mainstream in Western science, which said, as it was defining priorities in 2009, that one of the national priorities for healthcare research was to evaluate mindfulness-based interventions in areas like anxiety, depression, as well as pain, cardiovascular risk factors, and chronic disease. So there's some sense that these practices of mindfulness meditation have an important role in helping people to get well and stay well in the context of illnesses that in the West and really globally have been very chronic and difficult to treat. This mandate or this priority raises important questions that are the kinds of questions that the field of clinical psychology seeks to answer. And I want to talk about those by talking in detail about some studies and some of the nature of this intervention called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And I want to address 4 questions together today. One is, what's the rationale for using mindfulness meditation for problems like preventing depression? Why do we think that teaching people mindfulness meditation will be helpful for that purpose? And then the question of how do we do that? So what's in the toolbox, essentially, of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy? And we'll look together at this question of, does it work? And how do we know that? As well as, what are some opportunities and challenges that exist as we look to the broader horizon? So as I said, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, it's this very interesting integration of cognitive behavioral strategies and practices and mindfulness meditation as brought to healthcare settings by Jon Kabat-Zinn. And there's a quote, there's a lot of debate in academic psychology circles in the West about what does the word mindfulness mean. This is a definition, a kind of operational definition that Jon Kabat-Zinn gave, which he said it means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And this program was developed by some dear friends and colleagues of mine, Zindel Siegel, with whom I think you have spoken, Mark Williams, and John Teasdale. And it's an 8-week class that's focused on teaching these skills to help people prevent depression and promote their well-being and their wellness over time. Now, let's look together at this first question that I raised, which is, why would we want to pull from these practices of meditation for this purpose? And in order to answer that, as clinical psychologists, we want to start with the question of what's the nature of the problem that we're trying to alleviate here? And depression, we know, is a heterogeneous, it's a complex problem that's experienced by many people. And there are many there's much effort in science now trying to figure out exactly what depression is, but we define it now clinically by the experience of the presence of sadness that exists in a protracted sort of way, as well as a withdrawal from things that people enjoy and that give them a sense of pleasure and meaning, as well as a number of other kinds of experiences. One of the things we know about depression is that it's something that tends to persist in some form, and it's even after you have recovered from a period of intense depression, you're vulnerable to becoming depressed again. And in fact, the more times you've been depressed, the more likely you are to be depressed again. Now, one of the compelling explanations for that fact is this construct of cognitive reactivity. And this has to do with the way in which people's thoughts are sensitive to the experience of sadness. I want to show you a study that my colleague Zindel Siegel did, and I'll explain, there are two parts of it on this slide. I'll explain both of them on the next slide. What he did was he treated people who had been depressed to a point of wellness. And then he asked them about the kinds of attitudes that they held, how strongly they believed in these attitudes. He asked them attitudes like, if I fail at my work, then I am a failure as a person. Or attitudes like, turning to someone else for advice or help is an admission of weakness. Or, if a person I love does not love me, it means that I am unlovable. And people gave their responses to how strongly they believed in how strongly they held these attitudes, these thoughts. And then he asked them to listen to very sad music. And then he asked them to recall a time in their life in which they felt very sad. And then he asked them again, after this period of time, how strongly they held these or similar types of attitudes. What he found was, and then he measured how likely they were, or whether or not they experienced depression over the next 1.5 years period. And what he found was, this graph here, just to explain it to people, is called a survival analysis. And what that means is that each line depicts an episode of someone becoming depressed again. So essentially, the lower the line goes, the more negative the outcome suggests people are relapsing into a state of depression again. The solid line at the bottom demonstrates the people who had the strongest reaction of their thoughts to feeling sad were at very high risk of relapsing into depression again. The people whose thoughts were not so reactive, so if you felt sad, and basically you had your attitudes you held about as strongly before you felt sad as you did after you felt sad, you were less vulnerable to getting depressed again. But after sadness, if your thoughts increased in the strength in which you believed things like, and so what this suggests is that it's exactly at these moments when people experience emotions like, people who have been depressed experience emotions like sadness, that they're most vulnerable. You spoke about this, I think, 2 days ago when you were talking with Richie, I think, and mentioned in the experience of sadness how it's important to have a kind of courage or a conviction for action. And what we see in studies like this is that when people respond to sadness not with that kind of conviction to act, but instead an increase or an amplification of thoughts like, if I fail, then that means I'm a complete failure and there's no hope or encouragement here, then they are at greater risk of relapsing into depression. Sometimes patients with whom I work will respond to knowing about data like this and say, well, I don't want to be sad anymore. I'd like to eliminate the experience of sadness. And as we talked about the other day, that's not possible, but also probably not desirable even for us as human beings. But what we can do is help people practice in these moments ways of regulating, ways of working skillfully with the emotion of sadness and the thoughts that arise that help them stay well over time. And that's exactly where this toolbox, the Geshe-la who spoke yesterday or the day before had this wonderful line on his slide which said the toolbox for preventive benefit. And I think that's what this treatment, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, this integration in a sense of Buddhist mindfulness practices from this tradition as well as the Western cognitive behavioral tradition offers that to us. So can I spend just a moment describing the tools within this toolkit? From the mindfulness meditation standpoint, we teach people formal practices of mindfulness of the breath, of the body, of the experience of hearing, and then moving from there to the mindfulness of the process of thinking itself, the experience of emotion. But we ask people who participate in this class to practice 30 to 45 minutes of formal practice every day. And they do this in a way that's guided by the instructor. But we also ask them to practice in informal ways. So for example, mindful eating, or mindful brushing your teeth, or driving, or drinking a cup of tea. From this practice of mindfulness, the intention is really that people begin to become familiar and intimate with the nature of their own mind. And for people who've experienced depression, what that often means is becoming familiar with the distracted nature of their mind and the rapid nature of moving into a kind of automatic mode. Now we move from this foundation into the cognitive behavioral strategies, which really look carefully at what is the territory of depression? What are the warning signs of depression? And how can you bring the attention and awareness that's cultivated through the meditation practice to noticing how the mind moves in these automatic ways? So we often use the metaphor of automatic pilot, but in depression, when your mind is on automatic pilot like an airplane, it frequently flies not into a clear, vast, open sky, but one that's very turbulent and cloudy and dark. And so beginning to notice this at the earliest moments of shifting, and then how to step out of that automatic pilot and respond more skillfully. These practices are taught in the context of a group, and so people have the benefit of learning from one another and also from the guidance of the instructor, the teacher in the group. The attentional focus moves then across the 8 weeks on this gradient from more tangible, starting with literally the experience of eating a raisin, to less tangible, moving all the way up to what are the moments at which you're most vulnerable to your mind, in a sense, being hijacked by this stream of automatic thoughts. I want to include 2 quotes by people who described this experience after having done this course. And they describe, I think, the core skill here, which is this developing capacity to pause and to shift emphasis from the content of one's thoughts and the identification or the amplification of that content to an awareness of thinking as a process.
Less educated one, or economically well-being, or middle class.
Yeah,
How much differences?
it's an excellent question. So
So did 차바이어는 야 괜찮다리 된다 거든요.
So if that is a factor,
Yeah.
then we are also begin recognizing that there are other factors that contribute to regression, relapse, and so on.
So again, you cannot say this is absolute.
Therefore, you cannot attribute to the meditation practice, the benefits you're seeing?
Some other element, their background. And also I think genes,
Genetic
or
factors
from
play a
parents,
role.
from
Yeah.
so everything very, very complex.
Complicated.
Complex. Yes. Okay.
I agree with that completely. And one of the things I have watched many of these mind and life dialogues with you, Your Holiness, in the past years. And one of the things I love about these dialogues is that your questions often point to exactly what is important for the field to address. And I think you're doing that in this moment. It is very, very complicated. And I want to come back to this question if I can, because what you're raising about these kinds of individual differences between people is exactly one of the places that we as researchers need to begin to devote ourselves.
So His Holiness's question is the following: in the clinical practices and studies, has it ever been made an attempt that, for example, taking into account the specificity of the background of the patients, whether it could be socioeconomic factors or levels of education factors and so on, and then based on those individual differences, suggesting different forms of treatment that is really tuned to that particular background? Has any attempts been made to be that specific?
That
And also people who have faith or
Religious
non-believer
background,
also make differences.
religious background,
Right.
and
those are
And perhaps I think age.
age is a factor.
And the younger one who never faced a lot of problems. So once some problem happened, too much thought about because of the
Really,
disturbances. Older people, like author, I myself also include now old people. So you see, a lot of problems we our lifetime is to face. So these people, you see, I think because of the inner spirit, I think much stronger.
Stronger,
Much stronger. So I think many other sort of factors.
all of those, I think, are very important. Age and developmental factors, socioeconomic status, education. One factor in history, like what is your individual history, is very important. So one thing that we know with this intervention in particular is that it's hit, and I'll have a slide on this later, but it's been shown to help people who have histories of highly recurrent depression. So it has, say I'm someone who has had 3 or more episodes of depression in my life. If I do this class, it helps to reduce my risk of getting depressed again in the future by half. I'm protected at that level. But the studies thus far have suggested that people who have fewer episodes of depression, they don't show that same kind of benefit. So it doesn't afford them the same kind of prevention that it would afford, say, someone with 3 or more episodes.
And His Holiness is wondering why that is the case.
It's a great question. It's actually one that's still an open question for science to answer definitively. The one theory is that as people experience more episodes of depression, these kind of links that I was talking about in the ways that thoughts become reactive to the experience of sadness strengthen, in a sense, or become more automatic over time. And so that's why this type of training can be particularly helpful. The other explanation that's sometimes given, although this is a theory or a hypothesis at this point, is that people who have experienced more depression in their life are, in some sense, more motivated to engage in the learning and the practice that's required because they have learned through a hard teacher, in a sense, of the negative consequences of having a mind that goes quickly onto automatic. But I will come back to this question that you're raising in a few moments as well. Let me just briefly to elaborate on the experience of this change, just give you an example of one mother who did this course who said, one of these difficult moments, I was holding my 2-year-old, her son, and I put some milk in a cup and he just threw it. It spilled everywhere. There was this really big mess. I was so frustrated. And the very first thing I did was take a deep breath.
It reminded, His Holiness was asked to, put the drops of the polio medicine.
2 drops.
2
each.
drops.
Oh.
There were 2 young children here, sort of ceremonially. And one of the 2 children was very receptive, immediately opened its mouth and His Holiness was able to do it. The second one was refusing. He just kept his mouth closed like this. So he had to ask the mother to do it.
So I discouraged you. So, no, because of that, not much successful to try. So let mother do that. So little frustrations. Yes.
It's a wonderful example of exactly those kinds of moments. And the ability in that moment, as you did, to pause and actually find delight. Whereas people who experience depression, often what they'll do in those moments is to personalize it. So to say, what's wrong with me that I can't get this child to take the medicine? Why am I not capable of doing this? And does this mean that I'm generally not a very good person? Another person said, I have a much greater capacity for not letting myself get swept away by really intense emotion. And I have a greater capacity for being able to identify. And this part is really critical in terms of this core skill. That thoughts are not facts. I can unsee what's going on, what's happening in my thoughts, and I can step back from it and just watch it as a process. Here's, again, from my dear friend and colleague Zindel Siegel, did a study in which he, again, in this time, I'm going to show you a graph that's similar to the one I showed last time. It's a survival graph, so each time the line goes down indicates someone becoming depressed again. But in this case, he treated people in this study until they were well, and then he randomly assigned them to one of 3 groups. One group, they stayed on medication. So they all had been treated to a point of wellness with antidepressant medication. And in one group, they stayed on their medication. In another group, they stopped their medication and they were given a placebo medication, but they didn't know that they were given a placebo. So those groups, they didn't know whether or not it was an active medication or a placebo medication. And the other group was given the 8 weeks of the mindfulness cognitive therapy training. Now, this study randomly assigned people, and that's really important because of the question that you were asking. So if there were differences in variables like people's education or their family background or their clinical history, the purpose of randomization is to ensure that those are equally distributed across those 3 groups. And that helps us to be able to make causal inferences about the effect of the treatment. So what you see in this study is that for...
Oh, I just want to have a joke. I think among those depressed patients, I hope much less scientists who really use their brain constantly. So maybe their brain is quite strong. I hope.
His Holiness is hoping, is he hoping, right? In hoping that in this group of depressed people, very few scientists or none.
Those might be the most challenging, right?
Sometimes you say Buddhist top scholars or sometimes a little bit depression. Then they feel, oh.
So Holiness is saying that even among Buddhist scholars, sometimes you too see cases of depression. That sort of intrigues him. How can that be?
So scientists who really dealing with these things, they themselves are depressed. That very difficult. Yes.
Sometimes that's what's so important about helping the people who help others.